Welcome back, explorers, to Lost Shrine. Tonight I'm bringing you 9 spine-chilling true encounters from hikers who dared to roam alone through the rain-soaked trails of Appalachia. Each story blends the raw fear of isolation with the strange, unexplainable moments that will haunt your imagination long after the lights go out. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this with your friends. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. All right, pack your courage. It's time to step into the shadows. I've hiked alone in the Appalachians for most of my adult life. There's a certain quiet out there that I can't explain to folks who haven't felt it. The kind that settles in your bones and feels older than anything man ever built. I've crossed ridges where the only sound for hours was my own breath. I've slept in cabins without doors and woken up to bare tracks circling the porch. I've walked trails where the fog clings low, threading itself through the trees like wool from some unseen loom. But nothing I've ever experienced, before or after, feels quite like the night I spent on the ridge above Tucker Hollow. It had rained since noon, one of those steady Appalachian showers that doesn't crash down in sheets but instead commits itself, hour after hour, wearing away whatever stands in its path. The kind of rain that soaks through seams, no matter how good your jacket is. The kind that smells like moss and leaf rot and something metallic rising from deep in the soil. By late afternoon, the ground had turned slick enough that every step required attention. Twigs snapped like wet bones under my boots. Mud pulled at my soles. My breath shone white even though it wasn't that cold. It just felt like the forest exhaled something colder than the air itself. The fog started rising right around dusk. At first, it was just low mist hugging the edges of the trail. But then it swelled upward, thickening, swallowing bark and rocks and my own light. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The headlamp beam hit the fog and spread like a flashlight shining into milk. I remember feeling strangely detached, like I was moving through a dream where the trees crowded in too close and every direction looked the same. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me. Slow. Careful. The kind that don't belong to animals. At least not the animals I know. I've been followed by curious deer before. They move with hesitation, then sudden bursts. Bears lumber, unpredictable in their weight. Coyotes pad so lightly they might as well be ghosts. But these footsteps? They matched mine, perfectly. Toe first, heel second. Mud sucking under the weight of something with the same rhythm as me. I stopped. So did they. Immediately. Not a half beat late. Not the rustle of an animal startled by my stillness. Just silence. Heavy and suffocating, like the fog itself paused to listen. I turned my head slightly, not all the way. I didn't want to see something I couldn't explain, but just enough to catch hints of movement in the blur. There was nothing, just trees fading into white. My heart was hammering, but I kept telling myself the same thing over and over. Echo. It's just an echo bouncing through the hollow. Except echoes don't sink into mud, and echoes don't hesitate. I remember the exact moment I realized it wasn't an echo, because when I forced myself to move again, pushing forward with slow, deliberate steps, the footsteps behind me didn't start right away. They waited. 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. Then the rhythm returned, following me step for step again. I didn't turn around. Some part of me understood instinctively that doing so would make everything worse. I could feel the presence behind me. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that if I stopped, if I hesitated, it would stop too. The forest felt tight around me. The trail narrowing, though I knew it hadn't physically changed. My shoulders tensed. Every breath drew in the thick smell of wet bark. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but I could sense focus directed at my back, like eyes tracking the slightest motion. The ridge path twisted upward, and the night grew darker, though I couldn't see the sky. The fog absorbed what little blue remained. Rain dripped from branches in thick taps, steady enough to sound like someone whispering behind my ear. I kept moving, not fast. Running on that mud would have broken an ankle, but at a determined pace that felt like survival. All the while, step, squish, pause, step, squish. Always following, always matching. At one point I slipped. My heel shot forward, and my knee hit the mud with a wet slap. As I gasped and scrambled to get up, the footsteps behind me stopped again. But this time, they didn't just stop. They adjusted, like whoever was shadowing me had leaned forward suddenly, or shifted weight, or taken a reflexive half-step before catching themselves. It was subtle, but unmistakable. I felt the movement vibrate in the ground more than I heard it. That was the first moment genuine fear sank into me. I stayed on one knee for too long. Rain slid down the inside of my collar, mud seeped through my pants. I wasn't praying, but my mind repeated something like one. Just get to the fire tower. Just keep going. You're fine. You're alone. You've always hiked alone. This is nothing. This is no one. This is... The trail behind me squelched softly, like someone shifting their stance. I shot up and forced myself forward. Every Appalachian hiker knows about the old fire towers scattered across the mountains. Most are abandoned, rusting skeletons perched above the tree line. Some have missing steps. Some have roofs gone to rot. But they offer shelter. Bare bones? Yes. But better than the middle of the woods with something following you. The one on Tucker Ridge wasn't far. A mile, maybe less. But in that fog, it felt like walking inside a cloud that never ended. I kept my head down and my pace steady, ignoring the burn in my cab. The trail narrowed to a half-rotted boardwalk at one point, crossing a dip where rainwater pooled into a shallow swamp. My boots slid on the slick boards. I held my breath, terrified that if I fell here, whatever was behind me would close the distance. It didn't follow me onto the boardwalk. The footsteps paused at the edge of the wooden planks. I could sense it waiting on the soil, like it preferred ground under its feet. That detail bothered me more than anything else. If it had been a person, wouldn't they follow me onto the boards? Unless they knew something I didn't, or unless they wanted me ahead, not beside them. At the far end, when my boots sank back into mud, the footsteps resumed, but slower now, creeping, like it wasn't trying to match me anymore, but instead draw itself nearer in increments. I almost turned around then. Some instinctual animal part of me wanted to see, to confirm I wasn't crazy. But another part, deeper and older, warned that to look would invite something I couldn't face. I kept forward, nearly stumbling over exposed roots, focusing on the faint outline of trees widening ahead. After what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than 20 minutes, the fog thinned, not by much, but enough to reveal the faint metal silhouette of the fire tower jutting upward. Relief flooded my chest so fast I felt dizzy. The clearing around the tower looked exactly the same as always. A few fallen logs, tall grass oddly flattened by rain, the rusted metal steps disappearing into the mist above. But the footsteps, those stopped. Not softly, not gradually. They just ended. I stood at the edge of the clearing, dripping, shaking, unable to breathe properly. The forest behind me fell into absolute silence, except for rain ticking against leaves. No shift of weight, no crack of branches. Whatever had followed me stayed just inside the fog curtain, refusing to enter the open space. A small part of me dared to hope it wasn't a person at all. Maybe it had been an animal using the cover of trees. Maybe sound played tricks in fog, but the boot prints would erase any hope of that soon enough. I forced myself across the clearing and up the first few steps. The metal groaned under my weight. By the time I reached the halfway point, a drop of rain fell from the platform above and hit my cheek. Except it wasn't rain. The texture was wrong. It was thicker, carrying the heavy scent of soaked leather. At the top, I stepped onto the platform and froze. There were boot prints, fresh, deep, filled with rainwater. Each step pointed directly toward the ladder I had just climbed. They weren't mine. I checked immediately. Wrong tread pattern, larger than my size, heavier, judging by the depth, but the worst part wasn't that someone had been there. It was that the prints began near the center of the platform and ended at the edge facing the trail I'd come from. No prints leading away, no prints coming up the ladder. Whoever or whatever made those prints hadn't used the steps. I felt the back of my neck prickle. The air around me seemed colder. My clothes clung to my skin like icy hands. The fog swirled through the railings, moving strangely, as though something had disturbed it recently. I walked around the platform, checking every corner, every possible hiding place. The roof above rattled softly with wind, metal shifting in small complaints. I felt exposed up there, surrounded by fog that moved like restless water. There was no one. But the prints remained, and they were undeniably fresh. Edges still crisp, water still rippling inside them from some movement I hadn't made. I backed slowly toward the wall, unable to take my eyes off the spot where the trail disappeared into whiteness. My breathing deepened. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. Somewhere below, a branch cracked, not close, but not distant either. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against the corner rail, knees pulled close, staring at the ladder, half expecting a hand to reach over the top rung. Rain drummed steadily against the metal roof, masking smaller noises. Sometimes the fog moved in a way that looked like a figure walking just beyond the clearing. Sometimes I heard a single splash of mud, like a boot being lifted. Around midnight, the fog thickened again, curling upward around the tower legs until even the ground was invisible. The tower swayed slightly, groaning. Wind carried a strange smell, wet leather again, and earth turned up by something heavy. I kept thinking about the boardwalk, how it had refused to follow me over the planks, how it stopped at the clearing, how the prints appeared above me without any path leading to them. Sometime between 1 and 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps again, but not below this time. On the metal roof, slow, deliberate, right above where I sat. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I waited for a shadow to cross the slats of moonlight piercing the fog, but none came. The steps continued across the roof, then stopped as suddenly as they began. A drop of water slid down the back of my neck again, but it wasn't water. It was warm. I forced myself not to scream. The steps never resumed. Eventually, exhaustion dragged at me, though I didn't dare close my eyes fully. I drifted in and out until the sky lightened just enough to dissolve the fog's grip. By dawn, the forest looked almost normal. The clearing spread wide and empty. Mist clung low, but no longer smothered. Birds began their morning chatter, hesitant at first, then confidently. I climbed down the tower with shaking legs. The boot prints on the platform were gone. Not faded. Gone like someone had wiped the surface clean. I checked for any trace of disturbed water, any smear of mud. Nothing. Only the prints on the ground below remained. Mine leading in, none leading out. I left the tower without stopping to eat or reorganize my pack. I just followed the trail back the way I'd come. The mud wasn't as thick by then, but the footprints, Those matching ones were all still there. Every step mirrored beside mine, stopping where the boardwalk began, waiting where I'd fallen, always behind me. But at one point, maybe halfway back to the trailhead, I noticed something that hadn't been there the night before. A single, deeper print, off to the side, facing the woods rather than the path. Like something had stepped closer before turning away. I didn't follow it with my eyes. I just kept walking. When I reached my car, the morning sun was warm enough to steam off my jacket. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before turning the key. The forest behind me looked peaceful, untouched. No hint that someone had paced behind me all night. No sign of anything unnatural, but I knew what I felt, what I heard, what I saw on that platform. I haven't hiked alone since, and every now and then, when fog rises unexpectedly or rain softens the ground just right, I swear I can feel it again. That same waiting presence. Careful, patient, 3 seconds behind, always 3 seconds, like it never stopped walking with me. I should have turned around the moment the rain started hitting the ridge sideways. Anyone who's spent enough time in the Appalachians knows that storms here don't move like normal weather. They crawl in over the peaks like living things, dragging the wind behind them like claws. But I was already half a day into Cutter's Pass, a place old-timers warned me about the same way they warned kids not to wander near quarry pits or rusted rail bridges. The gorge twists sound, one old man told me outside a bait shop years back. Makes you hear voices that ain't there. See lights that don't belong to anybody. I'd always chalk that up to mountain folklore. Tall tales told by people who wanted hikers to stick near the tourist-friendly trails. But standing on that narrow ledge with rain turning the stone slick under my boots, I realized that Cutter's Pass didn't feel like any place meant for people. The air was wrong, charged, dense, like it wasn't just holding water, but holding its breath. My campsite had washed out behind me hours earlier. I'd watched the little creek beside my tent swell into a frothing brown river that snapped the stakes loose like they were toothpicks. There was no going back. The closest trail cabin was somewhere ahead. 3 miles, maybe 4 if the markers had shifted again like they tend to out here. The rain hit so hard the cliffs vibrated. I'd never heard anything like it. The whole gorge became a giant drum, every drop echoing off the stone walls until I couldn't tell where anything was coming from. I kept walking because stopping made it worse. When you're alone in a storm like that, stillness is your enemy. Stillness lets the fear settle in. Around 9, I reached the narrowest part of the trail, a ledge no wider than a dining table, hugging a cliff face that dropped 100 feet straight down. The lightning flashed, not white, but a strange bluish pulse that made the world look drowned and artificial for half a second. That's when I saw it. A warm, swaying glow far below, moving along the darkness at the bottom of the gorge. Orange and soft. The kind of light you don't see much anymore. A lantern, glass, old-fashioned, oil burning slow and steady. At first I felt relieved. A ranger, I thought. Someone else caught in the storm. Someone who might know the area better than I did. But then I noticed something strange. The lantern wasn't bobbing like it was carried by a person picking their way over uneven ground. It drifted, smoothly, calmly, like someone was gliding along the canyon floor without touching the earth. I stopped walking. The rain hammered my hood, rivers of water running past my boots, but all of that faded behind the growing pressure in my chest as I watched the glow. The lantern matched my pace. If I slowed, it slowed. If I paused, it paused. If I walked faster, it glided faster. Always the same distance below me, always keeping up. At first, I tried to make sense of it. Maybe the gorge angle was throwing off my depth perception. Maybe there was a hidden path parallel to the ledge I was on. But the more I watched it, the less any normal explanation held together. The lantern wasn't flickering like fire usually does in rain. It wasn't stuttering. It wasn't dimming. It just glowed, steady, unwavering, as if the storm couldn't touch it. I should have kept walking, should have ignored it. But I was exhausted, soaked to the bone, and the human instinct to call out for help is strong, even when every part of you is saying, don't. "Hey," I yelled into the storm. The sound bounced strangely around the gorge, coming back to me from above, behind, both sides at once. The lantern kept moving at the same slow, deliberate drift. Then it began to rise. Not like someone climbing with it, not bounding up switchbacks or scrambling over rocks. No bobbing, no shifting weight, no pause for footing. It rose with the same smoothness it had moved across the canyon floor, like it was being pulled by a wire I couldn't see. My breath caught as it climbed the cliff face without so much as brushing the stone. Higher and higher, until it reached 20 feet below where I stood on the ledge. Close enough that I could make out droplets of water sliding down the glass. Close enough that I could feel a faint warmth through the freezing rain. The lantern hung there, suspended, swaying slightly as though held by an invisible hand. My mouth felt bone dry, which didn't make sense because rainwater was pouring down my face. I swallowed hard and forced myself to call out again. "Hello? Ranger? Is someone hurt?" Thunder rumbled overhead, long and low, like something dragging across the sky. The lantern didn't answer. Then, through the storm, I saw movement behind it. At first, it was just a deeper patch of darkness. A shape where there shouldn't have been one. Not distinct, no clear silhouette, no recognizable human outline. Just the unmistakable impression of something standing behind the glow. Something with weight, with presence. The lantern brightened for a moment, illuminating the faint suggestion of shoulders, the edge of a head, the barest hint of a figure. Watching me. I couldn't see its face. Or maybe I just didn't want to. The figure didn't breathe, didn't shift, didn't flinch when lightning lit the entire gorge in a harsh electric wash. It simply watched. I don't know how long we stood like that. Me on the ledge, the lantern floating below, the shape behind it unmoving. Seconds, probably, but it felt like minutes. Long enough for the cold to seep into my spine, long enough for my brain to start screaming at me that this wasn't right. The Cutter's Pass didn't want me here. That whatever I was looking at wasn't interested in helping. The lantern suddenly flickered. Just once. A tiny, trembling shudder of light. Then it went out. Not dimmed. Not faltered. It was like someone had blown the flame straight into darkness, snuffing it instantly. I didn't wait for my eyes to adjust. I didn't try to see the shape again. I ran. My boots slipped on the wet stone and I nearly pitched over the edge twice, but adrenaline shoved me forward. I didn't care that the ledge was narrow. I didn't care that visibility was awful or that I could barely breathe from panic. All I knew was that I had to get away from that ledge. The storm swallowed me. The rain became a solid sheet, a curtain between me and everything else. Branches clawed at my jacket where the trail widened into a scraggly stretch of pines. Wind tore at the hood until the drawstrings bit into my neck. Behind me, far behind me, I thought I heard a sound, not footsteps, not breathing, a soft clink like glass tapping stone. I didn't look back. I kept running until the ledge ended and the trail forked toward higher ground. The cabin should have been close now, maybe 15 minutes if I pushed. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but the idea of stopping was worse than the pain. I kept glancing over my shoulder even though I couldn't see more than a few feet. Every shadow between the trees looked like a person. Every flash of lightning made me think the lantern would appear again. Rising through the storm, that warm glow slicing through the dark. It didn't. But the storm didn't let up. And every time I thought I'd outpaced my fear, the gorge would throw my own breaths back at me in strange echoes, warped and stretched until they didn't sound like mine at all. It felt like the mountain was repeating me, mocking me, warning me. When I finally reached the cabin, I nearly collapsed through the door. The inside was cold, empty, smelling faintly of wet wood and old ashes. I didn't bother checking the corners or the windows. I slammed the door shut and dropped the crossbar into place. For a long time, I just stood there with my forehead pressed against the door, listening. The storm raged. Wind howled across the tin roof. Rain hammered the walls. But beneath all that, threaded between it like a second heartbeat, was something else. A faint clinking, rhythmic, almost thoughtful. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, glass on stone. I moved away from the door slowly, my steps light so the wood wouldn't creak. The only window in the cabin faced the gorge. The rain streaked across the glass, made it impossible to see anything clearly. Just blurred motion, shifting colors, the pale distortion of lightning flashes. I crouched and lifted myself just enough to peek outside. At first, I didn't see anything but trees bowing in the wind. But then the storm eased for half a breath. Just long enough for the rain to thin, long enough for one lightning flash to hit the gorge floor like a stuttering camera shutter. In that silver-blue pulse, I saw it, the lantern, far down below, not moving, just sitting on the ground upright, flame burning steady and warm like the storm couldn't touch it. The next flash lit the gorge again. The lantern was closer. I jerked away from the window so fast I hit my shoulder on the log wall. My pulse kicked hard enough to make my fingertips tingle. I didn't look again. I didn't sleep either. I sat with my back against the farthest corner of the cabin and waited for morning, jumping every time the wind rattled the shutters. The clinking sound didn't go away for a long time. Hours, maybe. Maybe all night. But at some point, maybe just before dawn, it stopped. The storm faded with it. Not gradually like most storms. Just gone. Like someone flipped a switch. I didn't open the door until sunlight started leaking through the cracks in the walls. Even then, I took my time. My hands shook so badly I had to use both to lift the crossbar. The forest outside was still, dripping from the night's downpour. The gorge looked normal. Too normal. No lantern, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I hiked out of Cutter's Pass without stopping once. I didn't even rest when I reached the main trailhead. I just kept walking until I saw other people, real people, talking and laughing and eating snacks near the information board like the mountain behind them wasn't capable of swallowing someone whole. I've told a few people what I saw that night, but I leave out the parts that sound impossible. I don't talk about how the lantern rose like it weighed nothing. I don't talk about the shape behind it, or how the clinking of glass still shows up sometimes in my dreams. But there's one detail I never forget, no matter how much time passes. When I got home weeks later and unpacked my gear, I found something caught in the mesh pocket on the side of my pack. A tiny shard of glass. Smooth on one side, jagged on the other, burnt around the edges as if it once held flame. I don't know how it got there, but some nights, especially when it rains, I can swear it feels warm. I still don't know why I kept walking that night. Pride, maybe, or stupidity, or something quieter and meaner, the kind of stubbornness the mountains carve into you if you grew up around here. I'd been hiking since sunrise, following a section of trail a friend recommended as peaceful this time of year. by late afternoon the sky was already bruising over, dark clouds stacking behind the ridgelines like warning signs. But I was determined to reach the shelter near mile marker 32 because it was supposed to have a working stove, and the thought of warm, dry clothes felt like heaven. I'd been soaked twice the week before and promised myself I wasn't spending another night shivering in a wet sleeping bag. So I ignored the smell in the air, the coppery tension that always comes right before hard rain, and kept going. The rain caught me faster than I expected, big fat drops that slapped the leaves and thumped against the hood of my jacket. Within minutes, the trail turned slick, roots shining like wet bone beneath the beam of my headlamp. The only patch of cell service I'd found was miles behind me, on the ridge. I should have turned around then. Every little voice of reason I had was telling me to, but I'd already fought this trail for hours and I was close. Close enough that I thought I could feel the promise of shelter through the cold. By twilight, the rain had thickened into one of those sudden Appalachian downpours that feel less like weather and more like punishment. A sheet of cold slamming from above, steady and merciless. Water poured down the back of my neck any time I moved. My jacket might as well have been a sponge. Even my socks squished when I stepped. I kept my head down, fighting the muddy slope, counting the steps until I reached the turn that would bring me to the marker. When I finally saw the wooden post through the rain, I felt relief hit me like a shot of warmth. Mile marker 32. Just another half hour to the shelter, maybe a little more, depending on how washed out the lower trail was. I quickened my pace, boots slipping in the mud. Then my headlamp swept sideways, and he was just there. A man stood perfectly still at the base of the marker, facing the trail like he'd been waiting for someone. Not hiking, not resting, not sheltering from the weather, just standing. His clothes clung to his body, shining with how soaked through they were. Brown jacket, flannel underneath, jeans so heavy with water I don't know how they stayed up. No rain gear, no hat, no backpack, nothing. He didn't move. His eyes were open but unblinking, lids shining with the rain sliding over them. Water ran down his face in thin, constant rivers. He didn't wipe it, didn't shift, didn't shiver, even though he looked like he should have been freezing. He just stared straight ahead. I slowed because that's what you do in the mountains. You greet people on the trail. You help if someone's in trouble. Courtesy is part of survival out here. But something in me clenched up before I could say anything. A small tug low in my stomach, like the mountain itself was warning me to stay quiet. Still, old habits die hard. I forced my voice out. "Evening," I said, trying to make it sound friendly. Hell of a storm. Nothing. He didn't tilt his head, didn't flick his eyes toward me. Nothing. He might as well have been carved out of the marker itself. I hesitated, my boots sucking against the mud as I took a slow step past him, and that's when he turned. Not naturally. Not in the way someone acknowledges you. His head rotated with a stiff, dragging slowness, like each inch of movement cost him something. Like his muscles had forgotten how to coordinate. The rest of him stayed rigid. Only his head shifted toward me until his face was angled just enough to lock onto mine. "You're late." His voice scraped out of him, thin and strained, like a whisper forced through a throat that hadn't been used in years. I froze. I had never seen this man in my life. Before I could respond, he lifted one trembling arm. It took him a second. Slow, shaky, unsteady, like he was fighting himself just to raise it. He pointed down the trail, toward the bend where the fog was pooling thicker than the rain. The beam of my headlamp barely punched through it. "You need to move," he said. It followed you. Every instinct in me screamed to ask what he meant. Who was following me? What was he doing out here alone, without gear? Why did he look like he'd been standing in the rain for hours, maybe days? But something about him, the stiffness, the soaking clothes, the emptiness around him, locked the words in my throat. Fear came flooding in so hard, my fingertips went numb. I didn't say a thing, didn't look back the way he pointed, didn't ask. I just ran. I ran down that trail like some animal had sunk its teeth into me. The mud tried to take my boots with every step. Branches whipped my face. Rain hammered against my hood, drowning out everything except my own breath. I didn't dare turn around. Not once, because the whole time I felt something behind me. Not close, but not far either. A pressure at the back of my skull. A sense of being traced, followed, marked. By the time I saw the shelter through the trees, my lungs were on fire. I sprinted the last stretch and nearly slipped inside, slamming the wooden door behind me so hard the walls shuddered. I stood there gasping, leaning against the door with my whole body weight, waiting for something. A hand beating against it. Footsteps. The wet slap of someone running through the mud after me. But the forest outside was drowned in rain and nothing else. Eventually, my breathing slowed enough for me to peel off my jacket. Water poured off it in a steady stream. I hung it near the stove, lit the fire with shaking hands, and sat down hard on the bench. I couldn't stop, replaying the man's voice in my mind. "You're late. It followed you." I listened for hours. To the rain, to the creaks of the old wood, to every shift of wind, waiting for whatever he meant to show itself. But night passed like any other storm night. Slow, cold, relentless. By morning, I had half convinced myself I'd misread everything. Maybe he was hypothermic, delirious. Maybe I'd imagined his tone. Maybe the mountains were just playing tricks on me, like they do to tired hikers. But that didn't fit. There was something too deliberate in the way he stood. Something too knowing in the way he spoke. The words didn't sound confused. They sounded like a warning. By daylight, I felt braver. Maybe foolishly so. I packed up, dried my jacket as much as I could, and headed back toward mile marker 32. I wanted to see if he was still there. I wanted confirmation that he was just another unlucky hiker stuck in the storm. The trail was awful. Washed out sections, slick stones, mud that wanted to swallow your boots whole. Fog still clung to the lower slopes, thick and low, like smoke from an unseen fire. Birds were quiet. Even the wind felt muted. When I reached the marker, my stomach dropped. He was gone. Not just gone. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had ever stood there in the mud beside the post. The rain had washed away a lot overnight, but not everything. My own prints from the night before had left faint impressions. His should have been deeper. He'd been there long before I arrived. I searched the woods around the trail. Called out. Nothing. Just that heavy Appalachian silence that makes you feel like the trees are listening. I tried to convince myself that the rain had erased everything, or that he'd left early that morning. But the deeper truth was impossible to shake. The man I saw at mile marker 32, there was something wrong with him. Not supernatural, not a ghost or a monster, but something changed, something hollowed. I walked the rest of the trail that day, thinking I'd shaken the feeling, thinking the fear was behind me. But that night, 2 full days later, I woke up in my tent to the softest sound. A drip, slow, rhythmic, like water falling from soaked clothes. I thought maybe my roof seam was leaking until I heard it again. But further inside, closer to my feet. Drip, drip. I sat up as quietly as I could. The lantern was still warm from earlier. I turned it on with trembling fingers. The inside of my tent was empty. No footprints, no puddles, no wet gear hanging over me. But the sound didn't stop. I heard it outside now, behind the tent. Slow, heavy, like someone standing still in the rain even though no rain was falling. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I waited until dawn, every muscle frozen, listening to that impossible dripping from a man who shouldn't have been there, who shouldn't have known my route, who shouldn't have been able to follow me. By sunrise, the sound was gone. I packed up in minutes and hiked straight out of those mountains, cutting through brush and old logging roads just to avoid taking the same path back past mile marker 32. It took hours longer, but I didn't care. I never saw the man again. But sometimes, still, when I walk alone in the woods, I get that same pressure at the back of my skull, that same quiet sense that something is a few steps behind me, tracing the same path I take. Sometimes at night, when the house is dead quiet, I hear that slow, steady drip through the walls. I tell myself it's just old pipes, just settling wood, just leftover fear. But there's a part of me, the part that remembers his voice through the storm, that still wonders what he meant. You're late. It followed you. And if it did follow me, what happens when it finally catches up? I still don't know why I went out there that night. I've asked myself that question more times than I can count, and the only honest answer is that I thought I knew the woods. I grew up wandering that stretch between Laurel Fork and Cutter Ridge. I'd camped out there, fished out there, even spent nights alone when I needed space to think. That place was familiar to me in a way nothing else in my life ever has been. I trusted it, more than I trusted people, more than I trusted myself. But the woods don't owe you anything. And sometimes they show you something you weren't meant to see. I'd been hiking since earlier that afternoon, heading toward my uncle's hunting cabin just off the north slope. The plan was to spend the night there and head out before dawn. Weather was already building by the time I hit the Laurel Fork Trail, but I figured I could beat it. Appalachian storms roll in hard, but not usually fast. I'm not stupid either. I keep gear on me. I watch the trees. I listen. But the clouds moved in like someone had shoved them across the sky. The air turned wet and heavy. The woods went dim, and the wind started coming from the wrong directions, downhill instead of up. By the time the first drops hit, the air smelled like wet soil and cold stone, a smell I usually liked. This time it carried something else, something sour, like the scent that rises off overturned mud or something rotting beneath leaves. I pulled up my hood and picked up my pace, thinking I could still make the cabin. It was the kind of rain that seems manageable right up until it isn't. Within minutes, the trail was running with little rivers, and branches high above thrashed like animals trying to break loose. The Laurel Fork crossing came into view through that mess of rain. I didn't even realize how loud the creek had become until then. I've seen it flooded before, but that night it was different. The sound didn't just hit your ears. It filled up your chest. Water slammed against the rocks in a constant roar, frothing white even in the low light. Where the old wooden bridge had once stood, there were only a few beams left, darkened and slick. The storms a few years earlier had torn it out, leaving behind nothing but twisted supports jutting up like broken ribs. I stopped a few yards back, squinting through the downpour. If the water had been lower, I could have crossed downstream where the stones made a natural step path. Not tonight. The rain had turned everything into an angry blur. The banks were collapsing. Even the trees near the edge leaned as if the earth was being pulled from under them. I scanned the creek, trying to find a narrower place, a fallen log, anything I could use. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the river playing tricks. Echoes, water slapping wood. But after a few seconds, I realized It was a voice. A humming voice, soft and steady. It slipped between the gusts of wind and the surge of the creek like it belonged there, like it wasn't fighting the storm at all. High, delicate, almost fragile. It reminded me of the hymns the older women used to sing in the tiny mountain church I went to as a kid. The kind of voice that felt like it belonged to a different time. At first, I didn't move. I just stood there, head tilted, rain hitting my face, listening, humming. A woman, somewhere upstream. I should have felt alarmed, but I didn't. Not right away. Something about the voice felt calm, almost comforting, and in the chaos of that storm, it was the last thing I expected to hear. I found myself walking toward it without even thinking. The trees thinned as I moved closer to the old bridge remnants. The humming grew clearer, still soft but more defined, rising and falling in a slow rhythm. I followed the sound, boots slipping in the mud, heart beating fast but not yet with fear. I rounded a cluster of boulders near the water's edge, and that's when I saw her. She was sitting on one of the old bridge beams, the thick one that used to support the walkway. Her dress, long, white or maybe light gray, clung to her in heavy, wrinkled folds, soaked through with rain. Her hair hung over her face in wet strands. She sat perfectly still except for the slight rocking of her body, back and forth, like someone comforting themselves. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and despite the storm raging around her, she didn't seem to mind it. I don't know how long I watched her before finding my voice. "Ma'am?" I called out, raising my voice over the water. "Are you okay?" The humming stopped immediately. Not gradually, not fading out, just gone, cut clean. The air felt different the second it stopped, colder, like the storm leaned in a little closer. She didn't react for a moment. Then, slowly, she lifted her head. Not all the way. Just enough for me to see her mouth. Her lips were stretched into a wide, unnatural smile. Not exaggerated enough to look impossible, but wrong in a way that made my stomach curl. It was the kind of smile someone forces when they're about to cry. A smile that wasn't connected to joy or even friendliness. More like a mask someone had been wearing too long, one that hurt to hold in place. I froze, rain cold against my skin. "Ma'am, do you need help?" I tried again. She tilted her head just a little to one side, still smiling, still not showing her eyes. Then her hand lifted from her lap. Her fingers were pale and stiff-looking, like she'd been in the cold for hours. She pointed downstream toward the shallower crossing spot. The water was thundering there, churning around debris. The bank half eroded. She kept pointing. Her smile didn't change. I shook my head. That way's not safe. The water's too. She pointed harder, jabbing her arm outward in jerky motions. That smile, that awful, stretched smile. It twitched, wider. My chest tightened. Something primal inside me. Something instinctual told me to step back. The storm felt louder now, as if the woods themselves were warning me. When I moved just a single step backward, her humming started again. But it was different this time. Not soft, not calming. It came out louder, faster, swelling beneath the sound of the river until I couldn't hear the water at all. The pitch wavered, climbing higher, as if she was trying to drown out the world, drown out me, drown out the fact that I'd stepped away from where she wanted me to go. I stumbled. My boot slid in the mud, and I grabbed at a branch to steady myself. She rocked harder now, her body jerking with each motion, her humming vibrating through the air like electricity. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. Branches whipped my face as I scrambled up the slope, mud splashing under my boots. The humming followed me, echoing off the trees, bending around the wind. Even when I got far enough that the river should have drowned her out, I could still hear her, loud and insistent, like she was right behind me. I didn't look back. Not once. I just kept moving, lungs burning, legs slipping on wet ground. Every sound in the woods felt wrong. The snap of a limb, the rush of the wind, even the rain hammering the leaves. I don't know how long I ran before the humming finally faded. It went quiet so suddenly, I nearly tripped from the shock of it. When I realized I couldn't hear her anymore, I stopped, bent over, hands on my knees, rain pouring off me, trying to catch my breath. The woods were dark, but not impossibly so. The storm had eased just a little, enough that I could see outlines of trees instead of just shadows. Everything looked normal, or as normal as anything can look after something like that. I didn't go to the cabin. I turned around and went home instead, hiking the long way to avoid the creek. It took hours, and by the time I stumbled onto the gravel road, the storm had finally passed. My clothes were heavy, my skin numb, and my mind felt miles away from my body. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not at first. When I got home, I sat in the shower until the water turned cold, and even then I didn't move. I kept thinking about that smile, how it hadn't touched her eyes, how it had looked like something stitched onto her face, held there by pain instead of emotion. But mostly I kept thinking about the way she pointed. Not like she wanted help. Not like she needed rescue. It was more deliberate, more purposeful. Like she wanted me to step into that raging water, like she was trying to send me to the same place she had gone. For weeks, I avoided Laurel Fork. I told myself I was being dramatic, that the storm had messed with my senses, that maybe it had just been a stranded hiker in shock, someone from one of the old mountain families who didn't want company. But every time I tried to rationalize it, I'd remember the humming, how it had swallowed the sound of the river, how it had followed me long after she should have been too far away. Eventually, winter set in, and the idea of going back there seemed ridiculous. I convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion or stress. I even laughed about it once, trying to shake the lingering dread. Then spring came, and with it, the thaw. A local teenager named Alex went missing while fishing near that same crossing. They found his gear a quarter-mile downstream. His body turned up 2 days later, wedged between rocks in a narrow bend in the creek. The sheriff said he must have slipped, the current pulling him under before he could grab hold of anything. Everyone accepted it, except me. Because when they found him, he wasn't wearing the clothes he'd gone fishing in. His jacket and boots were gone. He was barefoot, dressed in only his undershirt and jeans, like he'd taken off layers before stepping into the water, or before someone led him there, or pointed. The day I heard the news, I drove to the trailhead and just sat in my truck staring at the path leading into the woods. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I told myself I wasn't going in, that I just wanted to see the place in daylight, nothing more. But the longer I sat there, the more something inside me twisted, because I knew. I knew the humming hadn't been imagined. I knew the smile hadn't been a trick of the rain. I knew she had been there, and I knew she hadn't been singing for me. She had been calling someone else, drawing them in. I didn't go down to the creek. I couldn't make myself. But I listened. I rolled the window down and waited, breath held, eyes fixed on the tree line. I didn't hear her voice that day, but sometimes, when the weather is just right and the wind moves through the hollows in that same low, mournful way, I swear I catch the faintest trace of humming drifting out of the trees. Soft, old-fashioned, patient. Like she's still sitting there on that broken beam, soaked in rain, rocking gently. smiling that awful smile, waiting for the next person desperate or foolish enough to get close. I don't hike Laurel Fork anymore. I don't go near the water. And if you ever find yourself on that trail, especially after a storm, especially near the washed-out bridge, don't follow the humming, don't call out to the woman, and if she lifts her head just enough for you to see her mouth, run. Don't wait, don't think, just run until the woods forget your name, because she won't. I've always said the worst part of hiking alone in the rain isn't the cold. It isn't the soaked clothes or the mud that tries to take your boots. It's the way sound changes. Rain muffles everything, it bends it, makes it feel like the whole world is breathing slow and heavy right beside your ear. I learned that the hard way in Markland Hollow, and if I'm being honest, that night still changes the way I hear rain on a roof. Makes my stomach tense, like I'm about to remember something I'm not ready for. But I'll try to tell it straight, the way it happened, because maybe getting it out will make it quieter in my head. I'd set out earlier that afternoon, thinking I could beat the storm rolling across the ridge. Markland Hollow isn't a place locals recommend hiking alone, especially not late in the day. Not because of animals or the terrain, but because it's old land. Strange land. Folks say it's where things go when they're tired of being seen. Things that aren't meant to be explained. I don't buy into that kind of talk. But I do believe a place can hold on to whatever happened there long before you ever set foot on it. I do believe some forests get sick the way a person does. And whatever sickness Markland Hollow had, I walked right into the middle of it. By the time the sky opened up, I was about 3 miles from my truck. The trail turned slick and dark, and the fog started pulling itself through the trees like it had a mind of its own. I kept my headlamp off at first, trusting the last bit of daylight, but the storm covered everything in a dim gray smear. Eventually, the rain got so thick I had to turn the lamp on just to see where the trail dropped. At first, it felt peaceful. Just me, the rain, the smell of wet earth rising off the ground. Then the quiet started to bother me. The way sound felt like it was happening too close. A branch would snap somewhere off to my left, and it didn't echo outward, it echoed inward, like it snapped just behind my ribs. The air felt heavy in a way that made it hard to breathe. I told myself it was just the pressure from the storm. Then, maybe halfway back, something happened that still makes my skin crawl when I think of it. I noticed movement on the trail ahead of me. Something long and thin slipping between the puddles of light cast by my headlamp. At first I thought it was just rain playing tricks. The droplets can stretch shadows into strange shapes, especially when the beam hits them at an angle. But this movement wasn't random. It was deliberate. It crossed the trail, left to right, like someone was walking behind the trees. But there were no trees there. Nothing for a shadow to stretch from. I stopped dead, staring at the trail ahead. The rain hissed around me. The wind pressed the branches together, and then the shadow slid back across the trail, wrong in every way. Too long, too thin, like someone had pulled a person's silhouette until it was stretched across the ground. I remember whispering, "No, I'm tired, that's all." But then another one moved, behind me this time. I felt it before I saw it, this strange pull at the corners of my vision. When I turned, there was nothing on the trail, nothing but rain. Then one of the shadows stopped moving. It froze in place about 15 yards ahead, stretched tall across the wet ground like someone was standing there. Except there was no one there. My headlamp lit up the trees behind it, thin oaks and hemlocks, but nothing was between me and them. Nothing to cast what I was seeing. I don't know how long I stared at it. It felt like minutes, could have been seconds. My mind wouldn't accept the shape. It tried to rearrange it into something that made sense. A trick of distance, a wet branch swinging, anything that could explain why a perfect silhouette of a person was standing dead center of the trail. Then it bent. Not like it shimmered or flickered. Those things at least would have meant it wasn't real. This was worse. It bent forward, like someone leaning at the waist to study me. I could see the outline of its head dip, long and narrow, like its whole shape was just barely human, but not enough to comfort me. And the rain was curving around it. Droplets hit the shape and slid off the outline like the shadow had a surface, like it was there, occupying space, even though nothing was visible in the beam except the silhouette on the ground. My throat locked. I stepped back. I don't know if I meant to. My body just did it. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was wrong with the world in front of me. I made the worst decision of my life then. I turned off my headlamp. I don't know why. I think I wanted a second to breathe, to reset my eyes, to make the shadow go away. But as soon as I clicked it off, the darkness swallowed me. The sound of the rain doubled, tripled, like it was falling inside my skull. When I turned the light back on, the shadow was gone. Everything was just normal forest again. Trees, fog, rain, the trail stretching ahead empty. I thought maybe I'd hallucinated it. Maybe I was exhausted, dehydrated, something. Then something moved behind me. Not loudly. Not the kind of sound a deer or bear makes. No heavy breaking branches. Just a soft, too soft, crack of wood. Like something large was trying very hard not to be heard. I spun with the headlamp and saw nothing. Just trunks and fog and the weird slant of rain through the beam. I wanted to run. God, I wanted to. But panic gets people killed in the woods. So I forced myself to breathe, kept walking, and told myself every step that I was almost out, almost safe. But the sounds followed me. Not close enough to see, but close enough that I could tell when something stepped over roots. When something brushed a wet branch and made it shiver. When something paused whenever I paused. After maybe 10 minutes, the trail dipped into a hollow. The fog thickened so badly my headlamp felt like it was shining through milk. That's when I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human ones. Bare. In the mud. And they weren't just ahead of me. They were beside mine. Following the trail I'd already walked. Each print was long and narrow, like someone with bony, elongated feet had matched my path exactly. The rain should have washed them out, but they were deep, fresh. I backed away from them, right onto something solid. Something behind me. My whole body snapped sideways. My hand shot out on instinct, but there was nothing there. Nothing my light could catch. Just this cold dread rolling through my spine like something had been inches from touching me. I started walking again. Faster. My breath got tight. My throat dry. I could hear the footsteps behind me now, even over the rain, soft, deliberate steps that never seemed to splash in the puddles or crush leaves. About a mile from the trailhead, there's an old hunter's cabin. It's barely standing. Locals say feral folks used to use it back in the 70s. Families who lived off-grid until they forgot how to come back. The place is rotten now, sinking into its foundation. But that night, with something following me, it was the only shelter I could think of. When I reached it, the cabin looked different than I remembered. The door wasn't hanging open. It was shut. The boards didn't look as warped. There were no vines over the roof. It looked like someone had been living there recently. I almost kept going, but the footsteps behind me grew too close, too curious. I could feel them pressing against the edges of the dark, like they wanted to step into the beam but were choosing not to. So I stepped into the cabin and closed the door. Inside, it was pitch black except for what my headlamp touched. Dust drifted through the air, thick and heavy. The place smelled like wet wood and something sour, like old sweat or damp cloth that never dried. There were no signs of anyone living there. No bedding, no tools, nothing but an old stove, a broken table, and a chair that looked like it had been repaired too many times. I backed into a corner and kept the lamp trained on the door. The footsteps stopped outside. For a long time, nothing happened. Just the rain, just the creaking of the roof, just my pulse pounding in my ears. Then the shadows started sliding under the door, not shapes of objects, not silhouettes cast from outside. These were long, thin streaks of darkness stretching across the floor of the cabin like spilled oil. They moved slowly, almost gently, like they were searching. When the first one touched my boot, I jerked my foot back so hard I hit the wall. The shadow didn't react. It just kept stretching and bending like it had joints. Then another slipped in, and another. They gathered near the center of the room, weaving together until they formed a shape. A silhouette standing upright, facing me. It was the same shape I'd seen on the trail. Tall, narrow, head tilted like it was studying me. The rain outside started changing. It sounded like it was hitting something solid around the cabin, curving around something invisible again. Just like before. The shape leaned forward. I lifted my headlamp higher, shining it directly into the center of the silhouette, and for the briefest second, I saw something. Not a face, not eyes, but the outline of a shoulder, a curve of something like a collarbone, as if there was a person there, wrapped in something that made them invisible except for the shadow they cast. Then the light flickered. Just once. But that was enough. When it came back fully, the silhouette was gone. I didn't breathe, didn't blink. I was sure it was behind me. I could feel heat, warmth on the back of my neck. The kind you feel when someone is standing too close in a crowded room. My hand shook so badly the beam danced across the walls. That's when I saw movement to my right, just a slip of something dark sliding behind the stove. Then to my left, then behind me again. The cabin wasn't empty anymore. Something was moving in there with me, but it refused to be seen directly. Only in glimpses. Only in the way shadows bent wrong around corners. I backed toward the door, but the beam caught something carved into it. Words. Fresh ones, cut deep into the wood. Don't turn the light off this time. My stomach twisted. It felt like someone had carved it for me. Like they knew what I'd done on the trail. Like whoever or whatever was in the cabin had been following people like me for a long time. The footsteps started again. Soft, circular. As if the thing was walking around me, tracing the edges of the room. My headlamp dimmed. "Don't," I whispered. "Please, don't go out." But the battery icon flashed red, and the beam shrank to a narrow cone. The footsteps stopped. I don't know what made me do it. Panic, maybe, but I threw myself at the door, yanked it open, and ran into the storm. I didn't look behind me, didn't care if the thing followed. All I knew was that the forest wasn't silent anymore. Every step I took, I heard branches snapping, far too softly for something moving that quickly. When I reached my truck, I slammed the door and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped the keys twice before getting the engine to turn. I didn't leave the parking area right away. I sat there, gripping the wheel, watching the rain blur the tree line. My headlamp lay dead on the passenger seat. Something moved between the trees. Not fast, not trying to hide. Just standing there, a faint silhouette against the fog, the shape of a person without a person inside it. Tall, leaning, studying me. I floored the gas and didn't look back again. That was a year ago. I haven't gone back to Markland Hollow since. Haven't camped. Haven't hiked alone. And every time it rains, every time the sound gets soft and close, I swear I see shadows slide across the walls of my house, where no tree outside could cast them. Sometimes they stop, sometimes they bend, and sometimes I hear footsteps where the floor shouldn't creak at all. I remember the moment I finally stumbled into that cabin near Shaw Ridge like it's carved into my memory. The rain had been relentless all evening, drumming on the metal roof so hard that for a while I wasn't even sure I could hear my own footsteps through the mud-soaked forest. The trail had turned into a slick, almost treacherous mess, and every few minutes I slipped or caught myself on a tree, my hands raw from gripping branches. By the time I spotted the cabin, its tin roof gleaming dimly through the downpour, I felt like I'd been wandering forever, like the world itself had narrowed to just me, the rain, and the promise of that small, weathered refuge. The cabin was nothing more than a single-room shack, the kind hikers sometimes stumbled across when misfortune or storms drove them off the trail. Its wood was dark and soaked through, nails sticking out like crooked teeth, but I didn't care. I had to get inside. I pushed the door open, and the air inside smelled of wet pine, old smoke, and a mustiness that clung to every corner. I dropped my pack with a wet thud and went straight for the small stack of firewood tucked in a corner. I had a few matches left, and I struck one shakily, watching the flame sputter and grow until it caught the kindling. The fire offered warmth, a fragile glow that chased away the shadows clinging to the corners, and for the first time in hours, I felt relief. I stripped off my soaked jacket and sat on the rickety wooden floor, letting the heat seep into my bones. The storm hammered outside, a constant white noise of rain against metal and wind through the cracks, and I felt myself starting to drift into a strange, uneasy calm. Maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe it was the isolation, but for a while, I almost forgot where I was. Almost. Midnight came, and with it, the storm peaked. That's when I heard it. A single knock on the door. It was slow, deliberate, soft enough to not sound panicked, but hard enough to echo against the wooden walls. My stomach sank. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The rain's roar was so loud I hadn't noticed anyone moving outside. No boots squishing through mud, no branches snapping, no faint beam of a flashlight. Just that knock. One knock, so out of place in the storm that it felt like it had come from another world entirely. "Who's there?" I called, my voice small against the drumming rain. No answer, only silence. Then came another knock. Lighter this time, like the person, or thing, was testing the strength of the door. My chest tightened, a cold dread sinking into my shoulders. I wanted to tell myself it was just some animal or a trick of the wind, but it didn't sound natural. Knocks don't come that measured from raccoons or deer, and the rhythm was too human to ignore. Against every instinct screaming at me to hide, I approached the door. My hand shook as I lifted the latch, cracked it open, and peered into the storm. Nothing, not even footprints. The mud outside had been churned by my approach earlier, but the small space in front of the cabin was untouched, as if no one had been there at all. I blinked through the rain, scanning the gray blur of trees and waterlogged undergrowth, and for a moment I wondered if my mind was fraying, if exhaustion had finally taken me. I shut the door quickly, sliding the old wooden bar across it, my hands slick and trembling. I settled back against the far wall, trying to convince myself it was over. But then I heard it. The soft scraping, slow and deliberate, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. It sounded like a hand brushing along rotten wood, testing it, feeling it, dragging something along the surface. My eyes darted to the corners, the firelight doing little to chase away the shadows. I didn't move. I couldn't. Every muscle in me froze as the sound traveled to the other end of the room, then stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping, loud and irregular, over the storm's dying roar. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. It was hard to tell. Then came the knocking again, this time from the back wall. My stomach knotted so tightly it hurt. I pressed myself into the corner opposite the door, trying to make myself small, trying to convince myself I could just wait it out until morning. The knocks were slower now, heavier, almost impatient. My mind raced. What was I supposed to do? The windows were tiny, set high, and the wood walls were thin. Whoever, or whatever, was out there could be waiting for me all night. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. I could feel it. I tried calling out again, louder this time, but the storm had softened, leaving a kind of oppressive silence. My voice sounded absurdly small in the empty cabin. I stopped speaking. I didn't want to hear a reply. I didn't want to see it if it came close. I sat there, pressed against the wall, counting every second, every heartbeat, every creak of the cabin as if my life depended on it. And in those moments, I realized just how alone I was. No trail, no other hikers, no ranger cabins for miles. Shaw Ridge could swallow you whole, and it didn't care. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was just as desperate as I was, taking shelter in the woods, seeking the cabin for warmth, for a fire, for a night off the soaked trail. But even that didn't fit. Whoever it was hadn't come in through the door. The mud outside was untouched. There were no signs of boots, no bent branches, no marks of passage. It was as if the knock had come from nowhere, as if it had materialized, just to remind me I wasn't alone. The night dragged on. I didn't sleep, not really. I listened to every small sound, the occasional drip of rain leaking through the metal roof, the faint whistle of wind through the cracks, the distant rumble of thunder that never seemed to end. Every shadow felt like it moved in ways it shouldn't. The fire dimmed, and I kept adding small sticks to keep a barrier of light between me and the darkness. I didn't dare touch the door again. Then, in the early hours, I heard the softest of sounds, almost a sigh, from the far side of the cabin. My breath caught, my eyes darted across the room, searching for the source. Nothing. I wanted to stand, to run, to see, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey me. I could only watch the dim fire, counting the seconds, trying to tell myself that once the rain stopped, once daylight came, everything would make sense. By the time the first hints of dawn broke through the storm clouds, the rain finally eased. The world outside was eerily still. Mud, leaves, and branches glistened wet in the gray morning light, but there was no one. No footprints, no sign of anyone having been there at all. The forest seemed to breathe silently, indifferent to the terror it had witnessed in that small cabin. I slid the bar back from the door, stepped outside, and the silence pressed against me, heavy and unnatural. I wanted to leave, to run down the trail, to tell myself I had been imagining it all, but deep in my chest, I knew I hadn't imagined it. Even now, weeks later, I can feel that night pressing in when I close my eyes. The memory of that knock, soft and measured, echoing in the hollow space of the cabin, haunts me. I've hiked other trails, stayed in other cabins, but nothing ever feels the same. Sometimes, when it rains and I'm alone in a quiet house, I swear I can hear it again. Just a single knock, deliberate, testing, waiting. And I remember Shaw Ridge and the little trail cabin, and how I realized that some places don't belong to us, not really. They belong to the forest, to whatever lingers in the spaces between the trees, waiting for you to feel alone, waiting for you to notice that sometimes being found doesn't always mean you want to be. I never told anyone what really happened that night. I've heard other hikers speak of strange noises in the woods, of cabins that seem to have been occupied by no one, of knocks on doors with no one outside. They laugh it off. They say it's the wind, or tired minds, or old boards creaking in the storm. Maybe they're right. Maybe part of me hopes they are. But I know the truth. I know that sometimes, when you're at the edge of exhaustion, when the forest has swallowed the last remnants of your warmth and safety, the world shifts slightly and something else takes notice. It doesn't want to hurt you. Not exactly. It just wants you to know that it's there. Watching, listening, waiting. And when you open your eyes to the quiet of dawn, you realize the forest hasn't let you go. It never really does. Even now, if I think too long about that night, I can feel the cold metal of the cabin door in my fingers, the way the wood bar felt under my palm, and the soft, impossible scraping along the walls. I can hear the knocks again, echoing just behind my skull, and I shiver, knowing that somewhere, in some corner of the world, that little cabin still stands, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to seek refuge, waiting to remind them that the woods are never empty, not really, and that some things, once they've touched you, never let you forget. I don't go near Shore Ridge anymore. I don't hike alone. I don't stay in cabins. And yet, the memory follows me. It lingers in the back of my mind when the lights are out, when the wind rattles the window panes. Sometimes I wonder if it was just the storm, my imagination, exhaustion eating at my mind. But deep down, I know it wasn't. That night, that knock, the impossible silence, the slow, careful brushing along the walls. It was real. And somewhere out there, the cabin waits. It's patient. It doesn't rush. It simply waits. Even now, I hear it in my dreams. One knock, then another. And I remember that rain, that darkness, and the way the world seemed to hold its breath while I sat against the wall, too terrified to move, knowing somehow that I had been noticed. And maybe that's the worst part. I'd been hiking alone all day, trudging through the thick Appalachian forest while a relentless rain poured down, soaking everything in sight. It wasn't a gentle, cleansing rain like the kind you see in postcards. It was the kind that presses into your bones, that makes your jacket and boots heavier with every passing hour, and that settles deep in the hollow of your chest so that each breath feels like dragging air through water. I could feel the mud sucking at my boots, hear the steady drip from saturated leaves onto the fallen branches, and smell the iron-rich scent of wet earth that sticks to your hands when you brush against a tree trunk. The sun was gone, swallowed by the gray, swollen clouds overhead, leaving only the dim, bruised light of a late autumn afternoon. After hours of trudging, I found a rock ledge that offered a little shelter from the rain. It was shallow, barely enough for me to sit and attempt a fire, but it would have to do. My hands shook as I fumbled with the wet tinder, coaxing sparks and hoping the soaked twigs would catch. I finally got a weak flame going, small and sputtering, the kind of fire that seemed alive more than warm. It hissed when raindrops struck it, sending tiny puffs of smoke curling upward. I wrapped my arms around myself, grateful for even this tiny source of light and heat, listening to the rain drum on the rock above me like an impatient audience, waiting for a mistake. I'd noticed something about smoke before, hiking alone in the Appalachian hollows during storms. It doesn't always rise straight. It drifts, clings low to the ground, curls sideways around roots and rocks, behaving almost as if it's alive. I watched the smoke from my fire, fascinated, and that's when I started seeing shapes. At first, it was just the long, twisting wisps, thin fingers of white and gray bending with the damp wind. I told myself it was nothing, just the smoke, just my imagination running wild from exhaustion and solitude. But then I saw it. One shape that didn't move with the breeze, didn't twist or bend like the rest. It stood perfectly still, a tall human outline pressed into the curtain of smoke, as if it had been waiting for me to notice it. I leaned closer, squinting. My heart picked up, but I told myself it was a trick of the storm, a shadow caught in the wrong light, a trick of the smoke against the trees. Yet the outline didn't blur. It didn't shake or sway. It just stood there, impossibly still. The smoke around it rose and curled in strange ways, like it was avoiding something solid. I took a careful step forward, and it moved back, silently. Not a crackle of mud, not a rustle of leaves, not even a tiny shift in the wet brush beneath its feet. Just a step back, measured and deliberate. My stomach clenched. My chest felt tight. The forest had gone silent. The rain continued, but somehow it felt muted, pressed back by the tension that had settled around me. The fire hissed as a sudden gust of wind swept through the hollow, carrying the cold, wet bite of the storm with it. The smoke scattered, whipped away in an instant, and for a moment I thought the figure had vanished. Relief rushed through me, shallow and desperate. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it had been the smoke, a trick of the weak light. I exhaled slowly, lowering my shoulders, telling myself to calm down. But then I saw it. It was 5 feet to my right, just outside the reach of the firelight, standing there as though it had been there the whole time, waiting for the flames to falter. I hadn't heard a step. I hadn't seen any disturbance in the mud or leaves. There was nothing but the tall, dark outline, impossible and patient, and I felt a weight settle on my chest. My mind raced. What was it? Who? Or was it something else entirely? The air felt thick, humid with rain, but it pressed closer, heavy in my lungs, like the forest itself had leaned in to watch. I wanted to move, to leap into the rain and leave, but my body refused. I was locked in place, staring, unable to breathe properly, unable to tear my eyes from that silhouette. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but every thought dissolved in disbelief. And then, as if it could feel me thinking, the figure did something subtle. The smoke around it, wherever it touched the fire's warmth, curled and rose like it was avoiding the shape itself. Not moving like a living thing, but bending around a solid presence I couldn't quite define. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Time had warped. The hollow became its own world, shut off from reason, from the day, from warmth. The sound of the fire sputtering became unbearably loud, the hissing like a whispering voice, small and threatening. Every raindrop felt like a signal. Every shifting branch seemed to mimic movement I didn't see. And still, the figure waited, silent, patient. Finally, slowly, it began to dissolve. Not like a person fading, but like a shadow retreating, like smoke disappearing into the air. I exhaled, weakly, shakily, not trusting that it was really gone. My chest still throbbed. My hands were wet and cold, but at least the immediate terror had lifted. I stayed put, too drained to move, my eyes fixed on the empty darkness where it had been. But even as relief surged through me, I knew it wasn't entirely gone. Something about the forest felt different, alive in a way it hadn't been before, aware of my presence, aware of the fire, aware of me. I tried to sleep under the ledge, huddled in my soaked jacket, but the forest refused rest. Every rustle of a branch, every splash of a raindrop in a puddle sounded like movement. Every curling wisp of smoke I could see in the rain-soaked air reminded me of the tall, dark outline, waiting. I drifted in and out of dozing, dreams punctuated with smoke that bent and twisted into impossibly human shapes. Standing just out of reach, waiting for the fire to die. I woke multiple times, convinced the figure had returned, peering out from the edge of the firelight. By morning, the world seemed normal again. Weak sunlight filtered through the wet canopy. Birds called tentatively, and the leaves glistened like they'd been polished. The path I'd stumbled along the day before looked innocent, welcoming even. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined everything, that it had been exhaustion and isolation and wet cold, making me see things that weren't there. But as I hiked out of the hollow, each shadow seemed too dark, each tree too still, each curve of fog curling at the edge of my vision felt deliberate, as if it remembered him, her, the figure, waiting. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Who would believe me? I'm still not sure I do, but I can't stop thinking about it. Every time I light a fire in the woods, every time I watch the smoke drift low and cling to the ground, I can't help but look for him. And sometimes, when the light catches just right, I swear I see a tall, dark outline dissolving at the edge of the flames. Patient, silent, waiting, watching. You learn strange things about fire in storms. Smoke behaves differently here. It hugs the ground. It drifts sideways. It curls like it's alive. And if you're unlucky, or careful, or just aware, you notice shapes forming in it. Shapes that shouldn't be there. Tall, impossibly still human, shapes that retreat with the fire, that dissolve when the warmth fades, that vanish into the dark as if they had been waiting for the flames to die. And then, long after the fire is gone, you notice how every wisp of smoke bends strangely. How it seems to avoid the hollow, how it clings to certain spots in the forest, leaving a gap where something unseen lingers. I've hiked alone many times since that night, carrying matches and a small lighter, always trying to coax a fire into life. Every time I notice the same thing. The smoke, the shapes, the way it bends and curls, and sometimes holds itself in a pattern that doesn't belong. I've stopped trusting my eyes in the forest after storms. I've learned to trust my gut, the tightness in my chest, the hair on my neck standing on end when the world should feel empty. And I've learned that patience is terrifying, that waiting, silent, unseen, and impossible, is more frightening than movement or sound. The last time I saw him, I didn't even realize he had returned until I felt it. A shift in the air, a cold pull at my spine. I glanced over at the fire and caught it in the corner of my vision. A tall, dark outline standing 5 feet away, just outside the light, the smoke curling around it like it had its own memory, its own awareness. I couldn't hear it move. I couldn't see feet shifting in mud, and yet I felt every part of it, as if the forest itself carried the knowledge that he was there, that he had always been there, that he would remain until I left, or until the fire died completely. And when it finally did, and the warmth vanished, the figure dissolved again, leaving nothing behind but the forest, patient and silent, and the memory of him that clung to me like smoke on my skin. I never hear him move, never hear a single step, never hear leaves crunch beneath his feet, and yet I feel him every time I'm alone in the hollow. Every time the rain comes, every time I start a fire, every time I notice the smoke behave oddly, I feel that patient weight on my chest, that presence waiting. You can tell yourself it's imagination, exhaustion, isolation, but the forest remembers him, the smoke remembers him, and when you finally let your fire die, you realize the truth. He doesn't need to move. He doesn't need sound. He only needs to wait and wait and wait. Even now, years later, when I hike through the Appalachian hollows, I glance at the smoke curling from small fires on the trail. or the morning mist rising over a puddle-strewn path. And I swear I see a shape holding still, a dark outline bending the smoke around itself, watching, waiting. And I know deep down I will never truly be alone in these woods. I will never be safe from the shape that needs no name, makes no sound, moves without a trace, and disappears only when the fire dies completely. And even then, it leaves a weight behind, a memory you can't shake, a reminder that the forest itself is patient, and that waiting is far worse than any scream. I've never been able to explain what happened in those mountains, and honestly, I've stopped trying. Some people hear this story and think I'm confusing fear with imagination. Others lean in like they're waiting for a punchline that never comes. But every word of this is exactly how I remember it, and remembering it is the part that keeps me up at night, because when I close my eyes, I don't see what happened. I see what almost did. This happened 8 years ago, when I still had this stupid habit of hiking alone after work. It was late September, that time when the Appalachian woods start to feel older, like the season change wakes something up under the soil. The days were getting shorter, the evenings were colder, and the forest carried this damp smell that reminded me of moldy books and creek stones. I'd been doing a 10-mile loop that cuts near the old fire tower on Cutter Ridge. It's not a trail most people use anymore because the tower's been boarded up and the ranger station closed, but that was exactly why I liked it. No people, no noise, just the woods, the wind, and whatever thoughts I was trying to escape that day. It had started raining around dusk. Not a heavy downpour, just the kind that seeps through everything slowly until you realize too late you're soaked from the inside out. My plan was to cut the loop short and take the ridge path back toward the gravel service road where I'd parked. That detour passes an old hunter's cabin, one of those pre-park structures that looks like it should have collapsed decades ago. I'd slept there once when a storm hit me by surprise, so I kept it in mind as a last resort. But on this night, I was trying not to stop. Something about the woods felt off. Not dangerous, just watchful. If you've ever spent time alone in the Appalachians, you know exactly what I mean. There are moments where the silence feels alive, like it's holding its breath with you. By the time the rain picked up, that feeling had gotten stronger. The forest around me had gone so quiet that even the raindrops seemed muted, swallowed by the dark. I remember adjusting my headlamp and checking the trail for mudslides or slippery roots, thinking the worst thing I had to worry about was spraining my ankle 2 miles from my truck. Then, maybe 20 minutes later, I saw it, the first light. At first, it looked like someone trying to signal through the trees, a pale bluish-white flicker, faint at the edges but steady enough that I figured it had to be a flashlight. It moved between the trunks in these slow, deliberate sweeps, like someone was waving it back and forth while searching for something on the ground. I stopped walking and listened. Nothing. No crunch of wet leaves. No snapping branches. No sloshing footsteps in the mud. Just that rain, soft and distant, and the faint pulse of the light shifting around 50 yards ahead. I called out. Just a simple, "Hey, you need help?" and immediately regretted how loud my voice sounded in the dark. My words didn't echo. They just disappeared like the woods swallowed them whole. The light froze. Not flickering, not shaking, just frozen in place, pointed directly toward me. I waited for whoever carried it to call back. Tell me they were lost, or injured, or anything at all. But nothing happened. The light dimmed, then brightened in one sharp pulse, then dimmed again. Not like a flashlight dying, more like a signal, a response. Then a second light appeared to the left of it, then a third. All of them at the height of a person's eyes. All of them turning toward me with the same slow, unnatural coordination. I don't know why, but my first instinct wasn't fear. It was confusion. My brain kept trying to rationalize. Maybe they were night hikers. Maybe they were part of a search and rescue drill. Maybe they weren't facing me at all and it just looked that way. But then they started moving. Not toward me all at once. Not rushing. Just gliding through the trees with this eerie smoothness, weaving between trunks and wet underbrush without making a sound. Flashlights don't move that way. People don't move that way. Not in the rain, not in darkness that thick. I took a step back, my boots sucking against the mud. The lights followed. I took another. They matched it, adjusting their paths like they were trying to keep the same distance between us. Up until that moment, I thought they were lights being held by people. But the closer they drifted, the more I understood something was wrong with that idea. Flashlights bounce when you walk. Their beams scatter on leaves, catch raindrops, break against branches. But these weren't beams. These were reflections. Like eyes, but brighter. Too bright, and moving too independently. My mouth went dry. I tried speaking again, another hello? But my voice cracked halfway through and I instinctively lifted my headlamp beam higher to get a better look. The instant my light hit the nearest one, it dimmed sharply. Like whatever it was didn't want to be seen. That was when fear finally kicked in, hard, primal, hot in the veins. I kept backing up the trail, slow, deliberate steps, never turning my back to them, and they kept coming. Same soft weaving motion, same unnatural pacing, never close enough for me to see what they belonged to, but never far enough that I could pretend they were anything normal. There's a point on that trail where the ground rises sharply toward a rocky overlook. I knew if I could get up there, I'd be closer to the service road and to open terrain where the forest thinned out. I remember telling myself they were probably people, drunk hunters, night poachers, weird campers, something. But that lie didn't help. Not with how they moved, not with how they didn't make a single sound. When I reached the incline, I turned and started climbing faster, my boots sliding, in the mud. I didn't run. I was too afraid that running would trigger something. But I climbed, hand over hand, mud under my nails, rain stinging my face, my headlamp bouncing wildly as I scrambled toward the ridge. Halfway up, I made the mistake of looking back. All three lights were closer now, maybe 15 yards away, spaced out evenly like they were herding me, pushing me upward. Still silent, still gliding, still wrong. And behind them, deeper in the trees, I swear I saw movement. Shapes without outlines, shadows shifting where the lights didn't reach. That was the moment I realized I was being watched by more than just those three reflections. I don't know how I made it to the top. I just remember dragging myself over a patch of slick, moss-covered rock, panting so hard the cold air burned my lung. I shoved myself upright and turned back toward the slope. And the lights were gone. All three. Gone in an instant, like someone snapped their fingers and shut them off. I stood there, shaking, soaked through, mud dripping off my sleeves. I kept waiting for them to reappear, for something to step into the faint glow of my headlamp. But the woods below me were empty. Pitch black except for the faint blue haze of moonlight behind the rain clouds. For a second, I thought I'd imagined it all. Maybe the lights were hikers who turned off their gear. Maybe they'd heard me scrambling and decided to leave. But even while I tried telling myself that, I knew it wasn't true. Nothing human moves like that. Nothing human watches like that. I should have kept going to the road. I should have left the mountain right then. But the rain got bad, really bad, and the ridge was exposed, slick with runoff. Wind hit me hard enough that I had trouble staying balanced. I knew if I tried descending the far side in that storm, one wrong step could send me sliding 100 feet down onto rocks. I needed shelter. The only shelter close enough was the old cabin. Every part of me screamed not to go there, but I didn't have a choice. The rain had turned into sheets. The wind was howling. Thunder rolled across the mountains like a growl. If those lights, those eyes, were still out there, nature was doing a good job drowning them out. So I turned, tucked my chin against the wind, and followed the ridgeline until I reached the narrow footpath that cut toward the cabin. That path always creeped me out. Even in daylight, it feels wrong somehow. The trees grow too close, their trunks bent inward like they're leaning over the trail to watch whoever passes through. The air gets heavier, colder. I told myself 100 times that it was just because the path runs between two steep hills, creating a natural wind tunnel. But that night, walking it in the storm, I felt like the hills were breathing. When I finally reached the cabin clearing, I nearly cried from relief. The structure looked even worse than I remembered. Tilted, sagging, half-rotted. But the overhang above the porch was still intact, and the interior was dry enough to keep me alive until the storm passed. I pushed open the door, stepped inside, and forced myself not to think about the possibility that someone or something might have been there recently. Inside, the cabin smelled like damp wood, old dirt, and something faintly metallic. There was an overturned chair near the cold hearth, and a pile of debris in the corner where the roof had once leaked. I closed the door behind me and slid the wooden latch into place. It wasn't much protection, but it made me feel better. For a while, I just sat there on the floor, back against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. Rain hammered the roof so hard it sounded like gravel being poured from a truck bed. The wind moaned through cracks in the boards. The whole structure trembled lightly with each gust. But inside, I felt hidden, safe, or I thought I did. It couldn't have been more than 10 minutes before I started hearing things. At first, it was faint, just a soft, intermittent tapping on the outside wall. Could have been a branch. Could have been rain hitting a loose plank. I ignored it. Then came the creaking, slow, groaning stretches of wood under strain. Normal for an old cabin in a storm. I ignored that too. But then, something brushed against the porch. It was subtle. Just a dry, scraping shuffle, like someone dragging their foot slowly across wet boards. My head snapped up. I held my breath. Nothing. Then it came again. Closer, weight shifting, boards dipping under pressure. Someone or something was outside. I shut off my headlamp immediately. The cabin fell into blackness, the kind that seems to press against your eyes. I waited, straining to hear over the storm. Another step. Slow, careful, then another, and another. Whoever was out there wasn't stumbling around like someone seeking shelter. They were moving on the porch with intent, with awareness, as if they already knew I was inside. I crawled backward until my shoulders hit the far wall. The door was only 10 feet away, but I didn't dare get closer to it. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, softly, 3 taps. Right next to the door frame. Tap, tap, tap. I thought I was going to pass out from how hard my heart was beating. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I felt like if I made a sound, even the smallest one, whoever was outside would hear it and... What? Come in? Break the latch? I didn't know, and that uncertainty was worse than anything definite. The tapping stopped, but the storm didn't. Thunder cracked overhead. Rain slammed down even harder. The cabin shuddered again. For a moment, I thought the visitor had left. Then something pressed against the window. It wasn't glass, just a hole boarded with 2 planks, but I could see the faintest shift of light through the cracks. A pulse, bluish-white, moving slow, moving deliberately. Another. One appeared beside it, and another. 3 lights, all at eye level, all watching me. I don't remember deciding to move. My body acted on instinct. I grabbed my pack, stuffed my soaked jacket inside, and crawled toward the back corner of the cabin where a section of wall had rotted enough that I could push through if I needed to. The lights shifted with me, dimming, pulsing, tracking my movement through cracks barely wide enough for me to see through. I pressed my back against the wall and pushed. The wood groaned. A piece splintered off. Cold rainwater splashed against my shoulders as the opening widened, just enough for me to slip out. The moment I was outside, the lights snapped away from the window. Not like they lost interest. More like they realized I was no longer inside and were adjusting. I didn't look back. I didn't check the porch. I didn't try to see what those lights belonged to. I bolted into the dark forest behind the cabin, slipping on wet leaves, grabbing branches for balance, nearly falling twice as I scrambled uphill toward the ridge. The storm should have drowned out everything, my footsteps, their movements, all of it. But even over the rain and thunder, I could hear something behind me. Not footsteps exactly. Something softer, quicker, moving in short, sudden bursts. Every time lightning flashed, the trees around me lit up in stark, terrifying white. And in those brief moments, I saw shapes behind me. 3, maybe 4. Something human-shaped, but not quite. Too still. Too synchronized. Always turning their heads toward me, their faces lost in shadow except for those faint bluish reflections. I didn't stop. Not once. Not even when I tripped and slid down a short incline, tearing my palm open on a rock. I forced myself back up and kept climbing until I reached the ridgeline again and saw the faint glow of the service road through the trees. And just like earlier, just like before, they vanished. All at once, like someone cut a wire. The storm calmed 30 minutes later. By the time I reached my truck, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the woods were quiet again. Peaceful, as if nothing had happened. I drove home, shaking so hard I could barely hold the wheel. I didn't sleep that night. I haven't slept well since. Sometimes, when it rains hard enough, I see those lights again. Not in the woods, but in the reflections of my bedroom window, pale, bluish-white, moving slow, deliberate, searching. And every time I shut off the lights and wait for them to fade. But part of me knows they're not fading, they're learning. I remember the storm hitting me before I even saw the shelter. It was one of those heavy, relentless Appalachian downpours, the kind that turns trails into streams and drags the forest down into an almost tangible gray soup. My jacket was soaked through in minutes, my boots squelching with every step, and I could feel the chill crawling into my bones no matter how fast I walked. The trail markers had almost disappeared into the sheets of rain, and I was beginning to think I wouldn't make it to the last shelter on Black Elk Trail before nightfall. I knew the rumors about it, of course. Everyone knew the whispers, the half-formed warnings that nobody ever put into words. But at that moment, desperate and shivering, all I cared about was dry wood beneath me and a roof overhead. The shelter appeared suddenly, tucked into a copse of old pines. At first glance, it looked unremarkable. 3 walls, a roof that had seen better decades, a raised wooden platform along one side. There were carvings etched into the beams, initials, dates, crude drawings left by hikers long gone. Nothing sinister, just echoes of those who had been there before. But the second I stepped inside, I felt it. The air was too warm, too still and heavy with a smell I couldn't place. damp wood, something iron-like, maybe blood, maybe just wet soil. The floor was dirt, uneven and worn, and my boots made small, squelching noises as I stepped forward. There were traces of disturbance, a narrow trail of dirt leading toward the far corner of the shelter, like something had walked there recently, though I'd seen no one on the trail. I set my pack down and tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a hiker who had passed through earlier, or the storm itself playing tricks on my senses. My headlamp, hanging on a strap around my neck, started flickering when I aimed it toward the back wall. Not erratically, like a dying battery, but in a pattern that felt deliberate, like it was trying to draw my attention somewhere I didn't want to look. The platform beneath me creaked occasionally, the wood groaning as if under someone else's weight, though I was alone. Or so I thought. The rain outside sounded muted, muffled, as though some thick cloth had been draped over the edges of the shelter. Everything was slightly off, a subtle wrongness I couldn't shake. Hours passed slowly. I tried to sleep, curling up on the platform under a thin, damp blanket I had stuffed into my pack. Every small noise, branches scraping against the roof, the drip of water from the eaves, made me flinch. My mind filled the silence with impossible scenarios, and then it started. Breathing. Slow, measured, deliberate. It came from the shadowed corner of the shelter, the corner furthest from the platform. I froze, my ears straining, trying to convince myself it was just the storm, or maybe an animal caught under the eaves. "Hello," I called, my voice small and tight. "Is someone there?" The breathing stopped. There was nothing but the sound of my own heart hammering against my ribs. I felt ridiculous, shaking under the weight of imagined danger, but then it happened. A whisper, soft, raspy, inches from my ear. "You shouldn't stay here." I bolted upright, my pack barely on my back before I was out the door. The rain slammed into me like a wall, my headlamp bouncing off the wet trees and reflecting in puddles that had formed along the trail. I ran blindly, the mud sucking at my boots, the darkness pressing in from every side. Every snap of a branch, every groan of the forest made me flinch, convinced someone or something was behind me. I didn't stop for 6 miles, stumbling over roots, slipping in the mud, heart in my throat the entire way. When I finally reached the edge of the state line, the storm still pouring, I collapsed against a tree, gasping, soaked to the bone, and still, in the back of my mind, I could hear that whisper echoing, "You shouldn't stay here." Days later, I tried to tell friends about it. They laughed at first, a nervous sort of chuckle that didn't quite reach their eyes. They wanted a story about ghosts or monsters, something tangible, something sensational. But the truth was far more insidious, and I couldn't explain it. It wasn't a ghost, it wasn't a person, at least not in any way I could recognize. It was the air itself, the way the shelter felt alive in that unnatural, patient way, like it had been waiting for me, watching me step in, calculating when I would start to notice. I remember every detail, the warmth that shouldn't have been there, the trail of dirt, the platform creaking under no visible weight, the flicker of my lamp, the muffled storm, the whisper so close it brushed my ear. And I remember the taste of mud and rain in my mouth, the exhaustion in my legs, the fear that I couldn't name. I never went back. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, that my mind had twisted exhaustion and fear into something resembling intent. But I still have dreams about that night. The shelter isn't haunted in any traditional sense. There's no chain-rattling phantom or clawed creature in the shadows. It's worse. It's the feeling of being seen, studied, judged by something silent and patient. Something that doesn't need to announce itself with terror because the terror is already in you. The shelter waits. and it knows who will come next. Even now, when I hike in the Appalachians, I avoid that trail. The forest itself seems different near Black Elk Trail, darker somehow, quieter, but listening. When the wind rustles the trees just right, I swear I hear that measured breathing again, slow and deliberate, echoing in the spaces between the pines. And sometimes, on stormy nights, I imagine that whisper curling around the walls of some shelter I'll never enter. You shouldn't stay here. There's a weight to knowing that fear isn't about monsters. It isn't about shadows or night terrors. It's about the subtle wrongness of being somewhere you weren't meant to be, in a space that observes you as much as you observe it. I replay that night over and over, remembering the texture of the air, the exact angle of the lamp, the way the wood groaned. The forest doesn't care about me. The shelter doesn't care about me. And yet I felt its presence, patient and waiting. I still feel it every time I lace my boots for a long hike, every time I hear rain tapping against a tin roof. It's a lesson in caution that I can't unlearn. Some places aren't meant for visitors. Some spaces hold memory, and some silences are too deliberate to be safe. I think the worst part was how normal it all felt at first. The shelter looked exactly like any other, and I had convinced myself I was fine, that the warmth, the creaks, the dimming light were just the storm playing tricks. But by the time the whisper came, by the time I understood that I was not alone in the sense I had imagined, I couldn't escape fast enough, and the knowledge lingers. Even in the Appalachians, where the mountains roll in endless green waves and the wind sings through the pines, there are places you step into where normal rules don't apply. The shelter on Black Elk Trail is one of them. Every detail remains with me. The way the air smelled damp yet iron-tinged. The way the shadows pooled unnaturally in corners. The way the platform shifted as if testing me. The way my own breath sounded loud and alien in the space. And above all, that whisper, so impossibly close. I replay it in my mind, thinking perhaps if I analyze it enough, I can understand what happened. But there's no understanding. Only memory, only dread, only the quiet, patient reminder that some places in the world are meant to be left alone. Even now, when I tell the story, my voice tightens involuntarily at the memory. I can feel the cold rain on my back, the mud under my boots, the inexplicable warmth in the shelter, and that cornered space in the far back where nothing should have been. The Appalachians are full of legends, full of stories to keep travelers wary. But the story I carry is not one that gets retold around a fire with laughter and bravado. It is silent, persistent, gnawing at the edges of memory. A reminder that some encounters leave no physical scars, but linger in your mind like a shadow you can't outrun. I haven't hiked Black Elk Trail since that night. I don't intend to. And if you ever find yourself hiking there during a storm and you see the shelter ahead, remember this. It will look ordinary. It will seem like a refuge. But if you hear the air shift just slightly, if you feel the weight of observation in the warmth of the walls, if your headlamp flickers unnaturally when you point it at the far corner, you should leave immediately, because whatever lingers there is patient. It waits, and it doesn't need you to understand it to claim your fear. I can still feel it sometimes, when I'm alone in a cabin or lying in bed with the wind rattling the windows. That precise, measured breathing from the corner, that whisper, the reminder that some spaces aren't made for us. That fear doesn't always roar. Sometimes it is patient, slow, deliberate, and it waits. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't run, if I had stayed the night, shivering and soaked in that shelter on Black Elk Trail. I don't know if I would have woken up at all, or if I would have, only to find myself forever changed, a shadow of the hiker I once was. All I know is the certainty of that whisper in my ear and the memory that will never fade. It's a terror that doesn't require explanation, a horror that doesn't need a face. It is enough to know that it exists, that it watches, that it waits. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I imagine it still, hidden in the far corner of that shelter, patient and entirely indifferent to the world outside.